"Your daughter says you're no longer mentally fit," the banker said. Margaret laid down the original deed, notarized and untouched. "She forged the future," she said, calm as a gavel. "I kept the past." Brielle was outside thinking she'd won. Inside, Margaret was revoking her rights, one signature at a time. They filed to erase her. She filed to remind them who still held the pen. "Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe." The voicemail was so calm it almost sounded routine. "Hello. This is Marcy from Westfield Community Bank. Just following up to confirm the incapacity certification your daughter submitted last week. We'll need your signature on a few things. Let us know when you're available to come in. Thank you." Margaret Sinclair paused the message, hand hovering over the phone like it had bitten her. Sunlight pooled across the kitchen tile, catching on the silver kettle she'd just set to boil. Outside, birds chirped against a cloudless sky. But inside her chest, something cold and heavy settled like a stone. Incapacity? She sat down slowly at the small oak breakfast table. The wood creaked beneath her as she replayed the message. Incapacity certification ... She exhaled through her nose, not with panic, but precision. At 69, Margaret still attended weekly book club meetings, managed her taxes without software, and could quote sections of the California probate code better than half the paralegals still working. Her hands weren't shaky. Her mind wasn't foggy. Her tongue hadn't softened into forgetful drifts of half-finished stories. But Brielle had been circling for months now, like a hawk in high heels. It started small. "Mom? You shouldn't worry about the bills, I'll handle it, and it's just a pharmacy delivery. Let me set up auto refill for you." Harmless things, kind things, until they weren't. The kettle hissed softly, the first warning of a boil. Margaret didn't move. Her fingers drummed the edge of her ceramic mug. The house was quiet, eerily so, the silence you only notice when something is missing, or being taken. She stood, calm but coiled, walked across the room, opened the hallway closet, and knelt in front of the built-in cabinet her husband, Thomas, had custom-built before the cancer came. She unlocked the middle drawer with a small brass key she wore around her neck, tucked behind the charm she'd worn since college. Out slid the beige accordion folder labeled Living Trust, 2016. The paper inside was crisp, unbent. She turned the pages with care, stopping at the tab marked Property Holding, Residential Asset. Her eyes scanned quickly. There it was, line 14. Ownership retained under Revocable Living Trust. Grantor maintains full override authority unless declared incapacitated by court-appointed evaluator. Not a doctor, not a form, not a daughter. A smirk flickered across her lips. Margaret straightened and made her way back to the kitchen. The kettle whistled, finally reaching its peak. She turned off the burner, poured herself a single cup, and stirred in a sugar cube, letting it dissolve in silence. She dialed the bank. "Westfield Bank, this is Caroline." "Hi, Caroline," Margaret said, her tone satin smooth. "This is Margaret Sinclair. I received a voicemail regarding some paperwork submitted on my behalf. I'd like to come in personally to review and sign anything needed." Caroline paused. "Oh, yes, of course, Ms. Sinclair. We weren't expecting to hear directly from you." "I imagine not," she replied, the smile never reaching her eyes. "Shall we say tomorrow at 10? "Yes, that works. We'll prepare the documents." "Lovely." She hung up. Her hands didn't shake. Her tea had cooled slightly, but she drank it anyway. Bitter, grounded. 3 years since Thomas passed, 3 years of birthdays and missed calls and frozen dinners. She'd given Brielle the benefit of the doubt, called it grief, called it help, called it growing pains. But now the mask had slipped. Margaret stood, walked to the bay window, and looked out at the yard. Her yard. The roses still bloomed where she'd planted them last spring. The rocking chair still swayed from where she'd sat just last week, reading Faulkner aloud to no one in particular. And her daughter thought she could take that with a form and a forged whisper. She pressed the folder flat on the countertop, the trust agreement open to page 14. "So," she whispered to the still air, "you wanted me out?" A pause. Then her voice hardened, barely above a breath. "Let's begin, sweetheart." Margaret pulled out her notepad, flipped to a fresh page, and wrote one word at the top in bold ink. Inventory. She said I was slipping. I made a list instead. The first time Margaret noticed something missing, it wasn't money. It was silence. Her weekly pharmacy refill, usually confirmed by a cheerful voicemail, didn't arrive. When she called, they said her auto refill had been canceled. "By your caregiver," the pharmacist added, voice cautious. "Your daughter, right?" Margaret stared at the bottle of beta blockers on her kitchen counter, the label 2 days out of date. The same medication Brielle had said she'd take care of, so Margaret wouldn't have to deal with pharmacy stress anymore. That had been 6 months ago. Since then, the changes came subtly, like a slow leak in a tire. One bank notice arrived saying her checking account password had been updated for security. Then a credit card statement went missing, her online access to the mutual fund account she and Thomas built over 30 years, locked due to inactivity. Each time she asked, Brielle would flash that breezy smile over Sunday brunch and say, "Mom, you're juggling too much. Let me handle the boring stuff, okay?" At first, Margaret had allowed it, grateful even. Grief fog, after all, was real, and Brielle had insisted it felt like care. But now, sitting at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad in front of her, Margaret realized this wasn't care, this was conquest. She clicked her pen open and wrote a title across the top, Incidents, Control Transfer Attempts. She dated the first entry, Pharmacy Auto Refill Cancelled. Second, Mutual Fund Lockout. Third, Password Reset Email routed to Brielle's inbox. Fourth, Bank Voicemail, RE, Incapacity Filing. Margaret paused, her fingers tightening on the pen. The next line she didn't write, but it echoed in her mind. Friends asking if I'm still hosting or feeling okay. At book club last week, Sharon had tilted her head and said, "Brielle mentioned you'd been a little forgetful lately. Everything all right?" Margaret had smiled, poured the wine, and changed the subject. But now she understood. She wasn't slipping. She was being slowly pushed. She closed the notepad, walked into her home office, and opened the old laptop Thomas had refused to replace, claiming the new ones felt like toys. It hummed to life, sluggish but loyal. Margaret typed in her password, opened her browser, and searched. Independent Cognitive Assessments for Seniors, Savannah area. She chose a clinic where no one knew Brielle's name. The receptionist on the phone was polite but surprised. "You sound sharp as a tack," she said. "I intend to stay that way," Margaret replied, tone clipped. The appointment was scheduled for Friday. Margaret circled it on her calendar with a thick red marker. That night, she sat at her desk and began digitizing everything. She scanned her trust documents, the original power of attorney, her medical directive, all of it into a password-protected drive. She recorded a voice memo explaining her current state of mind, naming dates and details, reading the front page of that day's newspaper aloud with deliberate clarity. She wasn't preparing for a battle. She was assembling a case. Her late husband used to say, "There's no courtroom like a paper trail." He hadn't been wrong. Just before bed, Margaret checked her phone. 4 missed calls from Brielle. 1 voicemail, cheerful, saccharine, ending in, "Love you, Mama." Then the text came in, "Hey, Mom? Just checking in. Do you remember your bank PIN?" Margaret stared at the screen, unblinking. A smile spread across her face. Not soft, but surgical. She opened her notepad again and added a new entry. 7. Text. "Do you remember your bank PIN?" Logged. Screenshot saved. She put her phone on silent, reached for her nightstand drawer, and slid out her old recorder. Tomorrow, she'd mic herself for brunch. Because the next conversation wasn't just personal. It was evidence. She forged a letter. I found the real one, with a notary's stamp. Margaret was halfway through labeling a manila folder marked Power of Attorney, Originals, when she saw it. The signature didn't match her own. Not completely. The loop on the G in Margaret was too stiff. Her cursive had always been fluid, with a natural lean. This one sat upright, calculated, and just a hair too perfect. She held the sheet to the light. It looked official enough. Letterhead, a date from 2 years ago, and her daughter's name scrawled at the bottom. Brielle Sinclair, appointed agent. It was a springing power of attorney form, activated upon a declaration of mental incapacity. The memory hit her in a sudden gust. 2 summers ago, in the middle of flu season, Margaret had been helping Brielle gather medical paperwork before a hospital outpatient procedure. They sat at the dining table, Margaret wrapped in a cardigan, still recovering from a mild fever, when Brielle had slid a form across the table. "Just a waiver thing," she'd said, light and casual. "If anything ever happens to you in a hospital setting, they want to know someone's authorized. It's standard." Margaret had signed without reading. Her vision was blurry. Her head ached. She trusted her daughter. But now, as her thumb ran along the crease of the paper, something felt off. There was no seal, no signature, from a third party. She dug deeper into her files. 3 layers down, she found the original, the one she did remember signing. It was from the same month, same title, but this one had a raised gold notary seal and a typed clause near the bottom. "This power shall only be activated upon written certification by 2 licensed medical professionals of the grantor's mental incompetence. This clause is non-modifiable." Her breath caught. She laid both papers side by side on the dining table under the pendant light Thomas installed years ago, the one that flickered slightly when the dishwasher ran. The forgery looked good, but not notarized, not binding, and certainly not legal. Margaret took out her phone and snapped photos of both. Her pulse was steady now, her face blank, but her fingers curled slightly at the edges of the documents like they could squeeze time into confession. The phone rang. She glanced down. First Bank of Westfield, Officer Monica Lane. Margaret inhaled once, then answered. "Mrs. Sinclair?" came a polite voice. "Following up on our call regarding the POA, we have a version on file that allows your daughter, Brielle, to manage and move assets on your behalf." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her voice silk-wrapped steel. "Yes, Monica, that's exactly what I'd like to discuss." A pause. "Of course. The version you have," Margaret continued, "did not come from me. Or at least, not in the form you received it. I'm looking at the original right now, stamped, sealed, and witnessed." Another pause, this time longer. "I see. I'm invoking Clause 2C of the original," Margaret said, standing now, pacing. "You are to place an immediate hold on all POA transactions. I'm formally contesting the legitimacy of the file in your system." The line was silent. "Understood," Monica said finally. "I'll freeze any active authorization. But Mrs. Sinclair, this will likely escalate." "It already has," Margaret replied. "I'll send you the notarized version before noon, and one more thing." "Yes? If anyone requests property access or asset movement," she said, each word shaped with absolute clarity, "you are to inform them the matter is under legal review." She hung up without waiting for a reply. She didn't slam the phone. Margaret had never been theatrical. She simply placed it back in the charger and folded the falsified document once, then again until it could no longer breathe. The real one she slipped into her accordion file under a new tab labeled Fraud Evidence. From the living room, the grandfather clock chimed noon. Thomas would have called this a pin-pulled moment, the part in a case when the evidence stops whispering and starts exploding. Margaret walked to the kitchen window and pulled back the curtain just as a black SUV pulled into her driveway. A man stepped out wearing a lanyard, clipboard in hand, state badge on his belt. "Just a wellness check," he would say. And Margaret? She would already have the kettle on and the recorder rolling. "They sent someone to see if I was confused. I served tea with a recorder on." Margaret saw the SUV before the knock. It parked with the quiet authority of someone who believed they were doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. Clipboard, lanyard, neutral khakis. She watched the man step out from behind her lace curtain. His posture was courteous but firm. Not a policeman, not a friend. Somewhere between. Official enough to carry weight, but vague enough to slip through the cracks. 3 knocks. Measured. Margaret opened the door wearing her pale blue knit cardigan, hair combed smooth, a fresh lipstick dabbed over her lower lip. calm, crisp. "Mrs. Sinclair?" he asked, flashing a laminated badge. "I'm Robert Gaines. I'm with Adult Protective Services. Just a standard wellness check. A concerned family member reached out, wanted to make sure everything's okay." Margaret smiled like a woman being handed a refill at brunch. "Of course. Come in." He stepped into the entryway, glancing around with the subtle alertness of someone trained to look for signs: stacks of mail, spoiled food, forgotten appointments pinned to corkboards. Instead, he found the smell of freshly brewed English breakfast, a living room arranged with intentional symmetry, and a vase of bright chrysanthemums perfectly centered on the dining table. "Would you like tea?" Margaret asked. "I just made a pot. 2 sugars?" He blinked. "That would be lovely, thank you." She led him to the sunroom, her favorite room, filled with afternoon light and the faint scent of lavender from a nearby candle. She poured the tea slowly, letting silence stretch between them. Across from his chair, tucked into the seam of a throw pillow, was a discreet audio recorder. On. "So," he began, clicking open his pen. "Can I ask you a few quick questions?" Purely procedural, Margaret folded her hands. "By all means," he began. "Do you know today's date?" "October 17th, Wednesday," she replied instantly, "though it feels more like a Tuesday." He chuckled. "It does, doesn't it? Who is the current president?" "Still recovering from the last one," she said with a smirk. "Joe Biden. And I voted, thank you." His pen scratched paper. "Do you manage your medications yourself?" "I keep them in a weekly pill organizer. I have prescriptions for propranolol and low-dose aspirin. Would you like to see it?" "I believe you," he said. She sipped her tea. "Do you know who contacted you?" He didn't answer that. Instead, "Have you experienced memory issues recently? Difficulty with cooking? Navigating your home? Dressing appropriately?" Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Robert, do I strike you as the kind of woman who forgets how to boil water?" He met her eyes. She didn't blink. After 10 more minutes, he closed his clipboard. "You're remarkably together, Mrs. Sinclair. I hope this didn't feel intrusive." "Oh, it did," she said smoothly, "but not in a way I wasn't prepared for." He offered a half smile, then stood. "If anything changes or if you feel unsafe, you can call us directly." Margaret saw him to the door. "And if someone else tries to speak on my behalf?" "We have protocols," he said. "But now that I've seen you—" She nodded. "Thank you for stopping by." As soon as the SUV pulled away, she returned to the sunroom, retrieved the recorder, and uploaded the audio to a folder labeled Wellness Visit, October 17th, full recording. Then she opened her laptop, navigated to the Department of Health and Human Services site, and filed a Freedom of Information Act FOIA request for the case report. She wanted their assessment in writing. A week later, the envelope arrived. Official seal, windowed. She opened it with the same paring knife she'd used to slice strawberries that morning. Inside, the language was clinical, but the meaning was crystal clear. Subject appears lucid, aware, and emotionally stable. No cause for further concern. Beneath the summary, handwritten in blue ink, likely by Robert himself, was a single underlined phrase: "Not what was described." Margaret folded the letter once, smiled softly, and slid it into a folder labeled Perjury Insurance. "They thought I'd be gone before the deed showed up, but I opened the vault." Margaret held the sealed envelope in her gloved hands like it was a time bomb, and in a way it was. She had pulled it from Thomas's fireproof file safe at the back of the closet that morning, buried beneath his military discharge papers and the love letters he refused to part with. The envelope was thick, yellowed slightly at the edges, and marked in her husband's careful handwriting: "Property. Final. Open only if necessary." Well, this counted. She sat in the conference room of Cole & Marks, her estate attorney's office, the room scented faintly of citrus furniture polish and old money. A framed photo of Lady Justice stared down from the wall behind Janet Marks's desk. Margaret unsealed the envelope slowly, her eyes not leaving Janet's. Inside were 2 things: The first was a notarized amendment to their living trust, signed 2 months before Thomas died. Margaret had forgotten about it entirely, written off as another peace of mind measure. But there it was, his clean signature, sharp and deliberate even with cancer in his bones. The clause read, "In the event of the grantor's death, all residential holdings shall remain in the co-grantor's name until such time she chooses to transfer or dissolve them. No external party may claim rights or assume authority without written approval from the surviving co-grantor." The second item was the original property deed, with Thomas's signature beneath hers, and a box checked at the bottom that read, "Grantor retains override authority, irrevocable unless otherwise amended." It had never been amended, never revoked. Janet sat back, reading it twice, then a third time. "This is airtight," she said finally, tapping her nail against the signature seal. "You have full ownership. All this business about incapacity doesn't change a thing unless a court declares you legally incompetent, and we both know how that report came out." Margaret didn't smile. "Not yet. I want it refiled," she said calmly. "I want my name alone, on every public record tied to this property. Brielle's fake POA doesn't override a deed. I want that documented." Janet nodded. "Done. I'll file it today. County clerk will have it in under a week. But Margaret," she hesitated, "once this gets out, things may escalate. You sure you're ready for that?" Margaret's voice was steady. "I've been underestimated for 15 years. I'm tired of pretending I don't know the law." She stood. "They wanted me out before the paperwork showed up. They never expected me to open the vault." Janet smirked. "You're about to shake their entire foundation." Margaret left the office with the originals tucked into her briefcase. She didn't stop for lunch, didn't drive home. She turned her car toward Westfield. Community Bank. The bank she'd co-owned an account with for decades. The bank Brielle had submitted her false forms to. The lobby was quiet, glass doors pristine, soft jazz humming low through overhead speakers. She stepped up to the reception desk. "Margaret Sinclair," she said, "I'd like to speak to a manager about refiling a deed. Sole ownership claim." The receptionist blinked, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am. One moment." She was ushered into a private office within minutes. A young woman in a navy pantsuit, Manager Davis, greeted her with cautious politeness. Margaret handed over the envelope. "These are notarized originals," she said. "My husband's final deed clause. I've confirmed it with my estate attorney. Brielle Sinclair does not have ownership or legal access to this property. She submitted fraudulent documents. This," she tapped the envelope, "is the correct record." The manager read quickly but thoroughly, her fingers stiff as she turned the pages. Finally, she looked up. "We'll begin the refile process today." Margaret leaned forward, her voice ice-wrapped velvet. "And I'd like written confirmation that no title, mortgage, or equity loan requests tied to this address are to be processed unless initiated by me. Directly, in person, no exceptions." Manager Davis swallowed and nodded. "Understood." Margaret stood, smoothed her coat, and walked past the tellers, who smiled without realizing what had just detonated. As she reached the glass doors, her phone buzzed. Text from Brielle. "Mom, why is the bank calling me? What's going on?" Margaret slipped the phone into her purse. "Now we begin, sweetheart. She said she was too busy for lunch, so I made other appointments." Margaret stared at her phone screen, the message blinking with sterile finality. "Brielle, can we reschedule lunch? Swamped this week? Maybe next month?" It was the third cancellation in as many weeks. No apology, no call. Just that clipped little heart, tacked on like a bandage over a bruise. Margaret placed the phone face down beside her teacup and leaned back in her chair. Outside, the garden was quiet, save for a squirrel scaling the fence with reckless joy. She should have been meeting her daughter at Bellevue Bistro right now, roasted pear salad, light wine, polite lies. But instead, she sat alone, with a growing sense that Brielle wasn't just busy, she was nervous. Margaret's instincts, once honed across decades of legal filings and clause reading, had started buzzing days ago. It wasn't just the silence, it was the timing. After the deed refile, after the wellness report, Brielle had gone from over-involved to strategically distant. And that told Margaret one thing: her daughter was regrouping. Fine. She could regroup too. She pulled out the card Janet Marks had slipped her last week. If this escalates, call Evan Lynn. Underneath was a single word: fraud. That afternoon, Margaret parked in front of a modest beige building marked LIN and Associates, Elder Law Specialists. The lobby was quiet, clinical, and smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and lavender hand lotion. A woman in her 50s with sleek gray hair emerged from a side office. "You must be Mrs. Sinclair. Evan's ready for you." Margaret followed her through glass doors into a bright room lined with case binders and law books, so dense they could anchor a ship. Evan Lynn was younger than she expected, maybe late 30s, sharply dressed, sleeves rolled above the wrist like he meant business, but didn't want to scare his clients. He stood to shake her hand firmly. "I've heard about you," he said with a slight smile. "You're already 10 steps ahead of most people who walk in here." Margaret arched an eyebrow. "Then you'll appreciate that I brought exhibits." She pulled a thin leather folder from her bag and opened it with calm ceremony. Inside, copies of the fake POA, the real one with the notary seal, Brielle's text about the bank pin, the wellness check summary, and the deed amendment with Thomas's signature. Evan flipped through the documents slowly, expression sharpening with each page. "This is, quite a trail." "Not exhaustive," Margaret said, "but compelling." He nodded. "It's more than compelling, it's actionable." Evan laid the last page down and folded his hands. "What you're describing is elder financial exploitation under Georgia statute, Section 30-5-3, attempted misrepresentation of control over assets, forged documents, and unauthorized use of legal authority." "She hasn't stolen money," Margaret clarified. "Yet." He leaned back slightly. "Intent matters, and what she's done already, the forged POA alone, gives you standing. You don't have to wait to be robbed to press charges." Margaret let the words settle. A strange calm spread over her chest. Not vengeance, not anger, just precision, cold and clean. "I want the POA officially revoked," she said, "publicly, legally, and with a paper trail." "And the fraud claim?" Margaret looked him in the eye. "Filed." Evan stood. "We'll take it from here. You'll receive a confirmation email with the revocation certificate, affidavit number, and case reference." She shook his hand again. "Thank you, Mr. Lynn." He grinned. "Don't thank me. You did the hard part already. You kept receipts." Margaret stepped outside into the crisp air, the sun now lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Brielle. "Thinking of you. Let's do lunch soon. I miss our talks." Margaret stared at it for a moment, then deleted it without response. Back home, her inbox chimed. From Evan Lynn. Subject: confirmation of POA revocation, plus fraud filing. Documents recorded, affidavit signed. The case is active. Margaret exhaled, closed her laptop, and whispered, "Too late for lunch, sweetheart." They bet on decline. I bet on documentation. The smell of burnt sugar and citrus hit Margaret the moment she stepped through the double doors of Brielle's faux Tuscan dining room. Mimosas were already being poured, voices rising in cheerful notes too sharp to be sincere. Sunlight spilled across a 12-foot marble table like it was staging a magazine shoot, not a family gathering. Margaret smiled gently, her purse looped neatly over her arm, a silk scarf tied at her throat. Beneath the scarf, in the lining of her coat, a slim digital recorder pressed cool against her ribs, live and logging. "Mom," Brielle chirped from across the room, air kissing past her cheek. "You look so refreshed. We were starting to think you'd gone off-grid." Margaret leaned in, her tone breezy. "Just been tying up loose ends." Brielle guided her to a seat at the far end of the table, strategically flanked by a sleepy cousin and Brielle's newest real estate investor friend. A man named Tyson, who introduced himself by saying, "Heard great things about your daughter. She's really holding the family down." Margaret nodded. "She's certainly holding something." The table broke into polite laughter, but Brielle stiffened slightly. It was subtle, barely a twitch in her jaw, but Margaret clocked it. Platters were passed, a ham glazed within an inch of its life, quiche that looked decorative more than edible, and tiny triangle sandwiches that were already curling at the edges. Conversation flowed like sparkling wine, just loud enough to make truth inconvenient. Brielle beamed through it all, hosting like she'd been born into the role. At one point, Margaret noticed her daughter leaning in toward Tyson, voice lowered, but not enough. "She's been struggling a little," Brielle said sweetly. "We're handling things quietly. I've been managing her accounts so she can focus on her health, you know?" Margaret lifted her mimosa and smiled. "Caregiving looks good on you, sweetheart. Very profitable." Brielle blinked. "What?" "I said I appreciate all the support. Really." Margaret dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin. "I'll be sure to have my attorney noted in the estate paperwork." A pause. Silence. Then forced chuckles, the table quickly shifting topics. Margaret's phone buzzed in her lap. Text from Evan Lynn. "Asset freeze request submitted. Waiting for court response." She sent back a single thumbs up, then discreetly opened her encrypted app and uploaded 3 voice clips and 2 photos. One of Brielle's latest unauthorized signature on a maintenance contract, and one of a revised deed transfer form she'd intercepted through the bank's alerts. Then, still smiling, she leaned forward and asked, "So, Tyson, what's your investment strategy? I hear some people are buying up properties in this area for, what did you call it, Brielle? Leverage?" Brielle's wineglass stopped mid-air. "Oh, Mom, let's not—" "No, it's fascinating," Margaret continued, her voice warm as honey but sharp as a blade. "These young folks are so resourceful. I've always admired that." Tyson, oblivious, launched into a rambling pitch about midtown flipping. Margaret nodded through it, hands folded. Behind her back, the app finished syncing her documents into a shared drive titled Sinclair Asset Protection, Active Case Files. The brunch ended in flutes and cake, Brielle clinking her glass to toast. Family resilience and stepping up when it matters. Margaret raised hers. To knowing who's really in charge, even if they don't say it out loud. No one clapped. Back in her car, the sun warming the dashboard, Margaret exhaled. The recorder was full. The app log updated. She reached into her glove compartment, retrieved a hardbound folder, and slid in the fresh evidence from today. She hadn't shouted, hadn't called anyone out, but the truth was now in writing, in the cloud, and on tape. They had bet on her decline. She bet on proof. Her phone buzzed again. This time a direct message from Evan. "Judge signed off. Full asset freeze in effect. House and accounts cannot be sold, refinanced, or leveraged. Immediate enforcement begins Monday." Margaret's fingers didn't tremble. She simply whispered, "Checkmate. I helped her get into law school. Now she helps me press charges." Margaret spotted her first, Carmen Rivera, seated alone at the edge of the cafe patio, black blazer draped over the back of her chair, a legal pad beside her coffee. Her badge was tucked discreetly into her purse, but it didn't need to be visible. Carmen's presence had always carried authority. Even when she was just a 22-year-old intern with ink-stained fingers and a hunger for justice. Margaret approached slowly, hands tucked into the sleeves of her cardigan, a small smile playing on her lips. Carmen looked up and grinned. "Ms. Sinclair, you haven't aged a day." "That's kind of you," Margaret said, sitting down. "But we both know that's a lie." Carmen chuckled. "True, but your posture still says don't try me." Margaret leaned in slightly. "Good, that's the message." The waiter brought over tea for Margaret without being asked. Carmen had ordered in advance, just like the old days when she'd anticipate what Margaret needed before she asked for it. Back then, Margaret had taught her the value of paper trails, of asking better questions, and of never raising your voice unless the room needed silence. "I'm sorry it's under these circumstances," Carmen said, turning serious, "but I read everything you sent, and I've already started preliminary review." She pulled out her tablet and swiped through several documents, the forged POA, the amended deed, Brielle's emails, the bank notice, and the wellness check report. "This is clean," she said, "which is terrifying. Because most cases are a mess, accidental transfers, conflicting statements, But this? This is methodical, controlled. She knew exactly what she was doing. Margaret sipped her tea, letting the warmth settle in her chest. She underestimated me. That's the part I can't forgive. Carmen glanced up. We're filing under Title 16-5-102, Elder Financial Abuse. It's a felony. But before we go loud, I want to run this as a formal inquiry. Quiet. Surgical. Margaret nodded. I don't want spectacle. I want accountability. She might start scrambling once we request her financials, Carmen warned. Asset transfers, estate positioning, bank authorizations. If she's planning anything, this will spook her. Let her scramble, Margaret said. I'm not the one who should be worried. There was a silence then, warm and familiar. It reminded Margaret of the first time she met Carmen. Nervous, determined, bright-eyed, and broke. Margaret had coached her through LSAT prep, offered her a worn copy of Contracts and Torts for the Real World, and told her to stop apologizing for being the smartest one in the room. And now, here she was, pen in hand, law on her side, and fire in her voice. I remember when you didn't own a blazer, Margaret said softly. I remember when you made me believe I belonged in one, Carmen replied just as softly. Margaret reached into her purse and handed her a fresh envelope, copies of Brielle's latest bank activity alerts, and a screenshot of a suspicious-looking wire transfer request she'd intercepted just yesterday. Carmen scanned it. Her expression changed. This timing's bad for her, she muttered. Asset freeze just went into effect. This could qualify as attempted circumvention. That's a separate charge. She tucked the envelope into her case file and stood. I'll submit it to our Financial Crimes Division. Expect contact in 48 hours from someone with an official badge. Margaret finished her tea and looked up. Carmen? Yeah? Thank you. For seeing me. And believing me. Carmen smiled again. This time it wasn't warm. It was razor sharp. You taught me to look for the quiet ones, she said. Turns out they're the ones holding the match. That evening, Margaret's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Carmen. Tell her to lawyer up. We're opening a formal case. Margaret placed her phone on the windowsill, stared out at the soft glow of her porch light, and whispered, Let's see how brave she is when the paperwork has teeth. She wanted access. I took back the keys. It was always going to come to this. The vault. At precisely 2:42 p.m., the branch manager of Westfield Community Bank received a notification. An access attempt had been made on safety deposit box number 1173. The system flagged it, not because the box was overdue or because there was an error, but because, just 3 days prior, Margaret Sinclair had walked in, calm as sunrise, and changed the permissions. She'd handed over 2 forms, one revoking shared access and another establishing herself as sole keyholder. No one else, not even her daughter. Now Brielle stood in the softly lit vault corridor, her face stretched into something that barely resembled the polished control she'd mastered over the years. What do you mean I can't get in? She hissed, her designer tote swinging at her hip. I'm listed. The clerk, a woman in her 40s with a tight ponytail and nervous energy, adjusted her glasses. I'm sorry, ma'am. The system was updated on Thursday. You were removed from the authorized access list. The primary holder didn't leave any secondary permissions. Brielle's mouth opened, then closed. That box, number 1173, had been her quiet contingency. She thought she could slip in, grab what was needed, maybe remove or reinterpret some things before the investigators got too close. Margaret had kept everything physical and old-fashioned. No cloud storage, no apps. She assumed her mother wouldn't think to touch it. She was wrong. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, folding warm laundry with the kind of serenity that could make someone uneasy. Socks, neatly paired, towels, smooth as parchment. Her phone buzzed once, screen lighting up with a short message from Evan Lynn. Access attempt flagged at Westfield, vault secure. Margaret placed the towel down with slow precision and walked to her study. She opened a small drawer and pulled out the tiny gold key with a brushed number, 1173. She ran her thumb over its edge. The contents of the box had never changed, not since Thomas died. But now they had meaning Brielle couldn't anticipate. Inside was her unrevoked living trust, signed, witnessed, airtight. Her medical directive, recently updated with her independent cognitive assessment, every page stamped with the doctor's seal. Her husband's letters, written in the final year of his life. In one, he detailed his belief in Margaret's mental clarity, even during his most painful treatments. Maggie is sharp. Sharper than most men I practiced law with. If anything ever happens, if she's questioned, this letter is my testimony. I trust her to carry the legacy we built. And there was one more thing. A flash drive labeled simply, "For Carmen." It contained recordings, dates, Brielle's phone calls, that brunch, even the wellness check. Margaret didn't need to weaponize it yet, but it existed. And more importantly, it was hers. At 5:15 p.m., her phone rang. The caller ID was blocked, but the voice that answered was clear. "This is Carmen Rivera with the DA's office. We've concluded our preliminary inquiry. You're officially eligible to move forward. Question is, do you want to press full charges or settle this civilly?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She stood at the window, watching the wind lift the edges of the garden tarp she'd forgotten to secure. Her roses had bloomed again. Late in the season, stubborn. Just like her. Her eyes narrowed. "Is she aware?" Margaret asked. "She knows we're involved," Carmen said. "But not how deep." Margaret let out a breath. "And if I press charges?" "It becomes public. Court dates. Depositions. Media attention." "And civil?" "She signs over financial control, withdraws all claims, and you set terms. But there's no record. No consequence." Margaret turned back toward the vault key, now resting on a pile of freshly folded linens. The past 15 years sat in her chest like stone. Every belittled opinion, every brushed-off concern, every time Brielle had smiled and called it help when it was really control. "Give me the weekend," Margaret said. She had her chance to be quiet. Carmen paused. "Understood, but just so you know, she's already called a lawyer." Margaret hung up, reached for her notebook, and flipped to a new page. At the top, she wrote, "Terms of surrender." She hoped I'd go gentle. I made a little noise instead. Margaret had never considered herself the kind of woman who called the press. That was for scandal survivors, whistleblowers, or celebrities in damage control. Not women like her, who paid off mortgages in full and baked for town fundraisers without ever needing applause. But silence had protected Brielle long enough. She sat at her kitchen table, steam curling from a cup of chamomile, her phone resting atop the notepad that read, "Terms of surrender." Next to it, Carmen's latest text. She's lawyering up. Just a matter of time before she spins her own story. Margaret tapped in a number she'd circled earlier that morning. Savannah Beacon, community desk. The reporter's name was Elise Trammell, mid-30s, sharp by reputation, and known for turning small-town cases into quiet revolutions. The line clicked. "Savannah Beacon, Elise speaking." "I have a story," Margaret said, voice even. "I'm not ready to go public, not fully, but what I've experienced, someone else will too." Elise paused, sensing weight. "Go on." Margaret spoke plainly. She didn't dramatize, she didn't speculate. She simply described the forgery, the fake incapacity claim, the revoked deed, the safety deposit box. Her tone was deliberate, professional, like she was giving courtroom testimony. And Elise listened without interruption. "You want to be anonymous?" Elise finally asked. "For now," Margaret replied. "Name withheld. But the story, every word, truthful." Within 48 hours, it was live. The headline was modest, but the impact was not. "Woman quietly fights back after daughter declares her incompetent to claim family home." The article described a retired paralegal in her late 60s who had been targeted by her own child using false legal documentation in an attempt to assume control of her home and estate. It cited power of attorney misuse, elder fraud statutes, and the growing epidemic of familial exploitation. Margaret's name wasn't printed, but the ripples spread fast. By day 2, the piece had been shared over 4,000 times on Facebook. The comment section overflowed with stories. My sister tried to do the same to my dad. My mother was declared unfit by my brother. She's still mentally sharper than I am. Emails poured in. Some were heartbreaking, some were furious. All of them thanked her for not being silent. Margaret read each one with quiet reverence. Some made her cry, others made her grip the edge of the kitchen counter and shake with something deeper than rage, recognition. But it was the call from the local courthouse liaison that changed everything. Ms. Sinclair, the woman on the phone said carefully, we saw the Beacon piece. Our office is hosting a legal panel on elder protections and fraudulent power of attorney filings next month. Would you be willing to speak? Margaret blinked. Speak? We need someone who's been through it. Someone who understands the legal system and the emotional toll. Margaret walked to her living room window. Outside, her neighbor's children chalked colorful suns onto the pavement. Her own daughter had once drawn suns too, bright yellow swirls across every surface until Margaret taped butcher paper to the walls just to preserve the paint. I'm not sure anyone wants to hear from someone like me, she said. The woman chuckled softly. Ms. Sinclair. Everyone wants to hear from someone like you. That night, Margaret sat at her writing desk, pulled a fresh sheet of paper, and started sketching notes for her talk. She titled it, When They Call You Crazy, How to Fight Back with Documents, Dignity, and a Damn Good Lawyer. As she finished the outline, her phone buzzed. Email from Savannah Legal Summit Committee. We're honored to confirm your spot. You'll be joined by a judge, a probate attorney, and a recently disbarred estate planner turned whistleblower. We suspect the room will be full. Margaret smiled. Time to raise her voice. They called me unfit. The doctor called it crystal clear. The envelope was thin, but it landed like a gavel. It slid through the mail slot at 9:03 a.m., crisp and cream-colored, marked with the seal of the North Georgia Center for Cognitive Wellness. Margaret stood over it for a full 30 seconds before picking it up, half expecting it to bite or burn or whisper something terrible. It didn't. It simply sat in her hand, quiet and ready. She carried it to the dining table, cleared off her crossword puzzle, and opened the flap with her letter opener, a silver one Thomas had given her after their 10th anniversary, engraved with "Let nothing go unopened." She unfolded the papers. There were 4 pages, clean, professional, no fanfare. The final line on the first page read, Subject demonstrates high cognitive functioning in all areas. Memory, executive function, language, and orientation are intact and consistent with, or above, age expectations. No signs of dementia, psychological impairment, or compromised judgment. Signed by Dr. Hadley Parks, board-certified neuropsychologist. Margaret's breath didn't catch. It didn't need to, because deep down she had never questioned her own clarity, not once. What she'd questioned was how many people were willing to let a lie stand if it came with a smile and a notarized stamp. She placed the report gently into a binder labeled Legal Response, Primary Motion. Next came the court motion. Carmen had drafted it the night before, but Margaret had insisted on reviewing every word herself. Every clause mattered, every comma. She read it aloud, quietly. Petitioner, Margaret Elaine Sinclair, seeks formal nullification of all statements and affidavits filed by respondent Brielle Sinclair on the grounds of fraudulent representation of medical incapacity. She signed it with a blue ink pen. No flourish. Just her name. Heron by noon. The courier had taken both. The motion and the doctor's report, neatly filed, bound, and double-checked. Copies already scanned and uploaded to the DA's secure portal. Margaret made tea and waited. Not nervously, but intentionally, because this was no longer about reaction, it was about restoration. At 4:46 p.m., her phone buzzed. A court calendar notification. Superior Court of Chatham County Probate Division, Sinclair v. Sinclair. Hearing date, May 12th, 10 a.m. Location, Room 4, B, 2nd floor, Judge Whitley. Presiding Margaret stood slowly and walked to her closet. She opened the cedar doors and pushed past the pastel cardigans, the muted blouses. She reached for the back, a tailored charcoal suit she hadn't worn in years, not since Thomas's memorial service. She ran her fingers down the sleeve. Then she chose her lipstick. Crimson Rise, the same one she'd worn to argue her final case before retiring. The one Brielle once called too loud for someone her age. Good. Let them hear it. She packed 3 binders: medical and cognitive records, estate and trust documents, fraud timeline, annotated, each one color-coded, tabbed, and sealed with laminated covers. Evidence, truth, defense and offense rolled into one. That night, she stood in her living room, binder stack on the table, suit pressed and ready, lipstick waiting like war paint. Outside, thunder grumbled softly in the distance. Rain tapped on the windows like fingers. Margaret didn't flinch. She simply whispered, "They thought I'd be scared of the courtroom." Then louder, "I built one in my living room." At 9:17 the next morning, Carmen sent her a text. The judge just got wind of the article. He requested hard copies in advance. His clerk said, "He's taking this one personally." Margaret placed the lipstick in her purse, zipped it shut, and whispered to her reflection, "Let the record show. I'm ready." She whispered that I was dramatic. The judge called me compelling. The courtroom was colder than expected. Polished wood, echoing footsteps, and a silence sharp enough to slice through fabric. Margaret stood at the plaintiff's table in her charcoal suit, red lipstick sharp as a blade, her 3 binders lined up like silent witnesses. Across the aisle, Brielle sat with her attorney, a young man in an ill-fitting suit who kept glancing nervously at the documents in front of him. Brielle's hair was pulled back too tight, her usual gloss gone. She wore a muted gray dress, but it couldn't mute the panic hiding behind her eyes. Judge Whitley entered without flourish, balding, grave-faced, and known for hating nonsense. The bailiff called the room to order. Margaret didn't flinch. "Ms. Sinclair," the judge said, nodding at her, "you may proceed." Margaret stood. Her voice didn't rise, didn't crack. It didn't need to. "Your Honor," she began, "what I'm about to present is not just a legal case. It's a story of erosion, one signature at a time, one form at a time, one lie told with a smile." She opened binder number 1, medical and cognitive records. She read from the neuropsychologist's report, held it up. "This was filed 1 week after my daughter declared I was mentally unsound." Next, binder number 2, trust and financial documents. She turned to the forged power of attorney. "This version was submitted to Westfield Bank. It is not the one I signed. The one I signed," she held up the notarized original, "contains a springing clause requiring 2 medical evaluations. There were none." Margaret's voice never wavered, but the room did. The tension shifted. Even Brielle's attorney stopped scribbling. Margaret continued. She presented screenshots of unauthorized bank alerts, email threads showing Brielle rerouting financial notifications to her own address, a timeline of missed pharmacy orders, mail diversions, and estate tampering. "I brought receipts," she said quietly. "And I brought the truth." Judge Whitley raised a brow. "And the audio files?" "They've been entered into evidence," Carmen said from the gallery, seated just behind Margaret. "With timestamps." Brielle shifted in her seat, her heels scraping against the floor as she stood. "Your Honor, this isn't—" She turned toward Margaret, eyes wide, voice trembling with forced sweetness. "I was just trying to help. She's alone. I was scared she'd forget things. I wasn't trying to hurt her." I swear Judge Whitley didn't blink. "Ms. Sinclair," he said, leveling his eyes at Brielle, "I find it interesting you're now painting yourself as a caregiver when, by all documentation, you systematically removed your mother's independence without cause or court oversight." Brielle opened her mouth, closed it. Margaret looked straight ahead. No gloating, just endurance. "Is there anything else you wish to add?" the judge asked Margaret. "Yes," she said. "I believe it matters that we acknowledge what abuse looks like when it wears perfume and signs in cursive. It doesn't always hit. Sometimes it erodes. But the result is the same. Control stolen, dignity undermined." The room was silent except for the soft tap of the court clerk typing. The judge sat back. "Well," he said after a pause, "that's the most thorough presentation I've seen in 15 years of probate hearings." Brielle's attorney stood, visibly sweating. Request mediation instead of a court ruling. Request noted, Judge Whitley said dryly, but not granted. I have everything I need. He removed his glasses. Ms. Sinclair? Margaret. Please take a seat. You'll want to be sitting for the decision. Margaret met his eyes, her pulse finally beginning to race. For the first time all morning, her hands trembled ever so slightly as she pulled out her chair, lowered herself down and folded them on the table. Whatever was coming, it was going on the record. They filed to remove me. I filed to remove them. The courtroom settled into a hush so complete that even the click of the judge's pen cap sounded like a gavel. Margaret sat upright, her shoulders square, her fingers calmly folded in her lap. The morning had stretched long and tight, like a wire ready to snap, but she hadn't broken. Not during testimony, not during cross-examination, not even when Brielle had taken the stand and called her paranoid, confused, and grieving herself into instability. Now came the moment the room had been waiting for, the part no one could embellish or spin. The judge would speak, and what he said would stick to the walls long after everyone had walked out. Judge Whitley cleared his throat and leaned slightly forward. His tone remained calm, but the weight in it was unmistakable. I have reviewed the filings, the cognitive evaluations, the estate documents, the audio evidence, and all materials submitted by both parties in Sinclair versus Sinclair, he began. And I must state plainly, it is rare to see a case of elder financial manipulation so thoroughly documented. Margaret's lawyer, Janet Marks, sat still beside her, nodding once, subtly. Margaret Elaine Sinclair, the judge continued, turning his gaze directly to her. You remain, by every legal standard available to this court, fully competent, mentally sound, and in possession of all your civil and fiduciary rights. The attempt by Ms. Brielle Sinclair to usurp those rights through the use of falsified documentation and unsubstantiated claims has been deemed both unethical and unlawful. There was no dramatic gasp from the gallery, no outburst from Brielle, just a stunned, hollow stillness. Across the aisle, Brielle sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if she could hold the ground steady by sheer will. Her attorney whispered something into her ear, but she didn't seem to register it. The glossy sheen of her carefully presented appearance was beginning to dull. As of this ruling, Judge Whitley continued, all powers of attorney previously filed by the respondent are hereby revoked. The Sinclair residence, including all attached assets and titles, is reinstated fully and solely to the ownership of Ms. Margaret Sinclair. Margaret closed her eyes for half a second, not in relief, not in exhaustion, but in quiet acknowledgement. She had come prepared for a war of whispers, but the court had spoken loudly and clearly. Furthermore, the judge said, his voice tightening, this court will submit a formal referral to the district attorney's office. The circumstances presented rise to the level of criminal inquiry for elder exploitation under Georgia state law. Ms. Brielle Sinclair may be contacted for further legal proceedings. Janet turned her head slightly toward Margaret, but said nothing. She didn't need to. Margaret had already heard every word in full color. Judge Whitley looked between them. This hearing is concluded. All legal records are updated as of this ruling. With a firm rap of the gavel, the case was closed. As the courtroom began to stir, papers rustling, chairs sliding, Margaret stood slowly. She didn't look at her daughter. She didn't need to. Instead, she walked out with her chin lifted and her step sure, the echo of her heels like punctuation marks on the marble floor. Outside the courthouse, the sky had cleared. The sharp, early spring breeze swept through the trees, fluttering the edges of her scarf. Carmen waited on the sidewalk, arms crossed, a faint smile forming as Margaret stepped into the sun. You did it, Carmen said. No, Margaret replied, her voice even. I proved what never should have been questioned. That afternoon, in the quiet of Janet Marks's office, Margaret sat across from a fresh stack of paperwork. No courtroom, no gavel, just a pen and a notary seal waiting to finalize what had already been spoken aloud. Here it is, Janet said, sliding the document forward. This transfers the deed, officially, legally, cleanly. You're now the sole owner, again. Margaret took the pen in hand and signed slowly, pressing her full name into permanence. Margaret Elaine Sinclair. The ink dried as her home, her name, and her legacy became hers once more. Not by default, not by inheritance, but by sheer, earned reclamation. As she slipped the copy of the deed into her leather folder, Margaret's phone vibrated with a quiet buzz. A text had come through. From Carmen. Heads up. Brielle's financial advisor just filed a request to dissolve her trust account. She's liquidating. Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, then softly said aloud, "Good. Let her withdraw." "I already did. She said I wouldn't last much longer. I changed the locks instead." The locksmith arrived just after sunrise, his truck humming quietly in the driveway as robins picked through. Dew-wet grass. Margaret met him at the door in a soft blue sweater, her hair swept back and secured with a silver clip Thomas had once bought her at a state fair. "I need everything rekeyed," she said simply. "Every lock, front, back, garage, even the basement access panel." The man, young, polite, sleeves already dusted with sawdust, nodded with quiet respect. "Understood, ma'am. You have the originals?" "Not anymore," Margaret said, handing over the spare keys she'd pulled from the drawer where Brielle used to help herself. "Let's make this permanent." By noon, every lock in the house had been replaced. The front door now clicked with a new weight, a new sound. Not louder, but more certain. She ran her fingers along the new brass plate. Smooth, secure, final. Next came the garden. The old rosebush, the one Brielle always complained was too high maintenance, was trimmed with care and retied to the trellis. Margaret knelt in the soil, her hands in soft cotton gloves, pulling out the weeds that had gathered while her attention had been elsewhere. Tulip bulbs were replanted, daffodils reorganized. She added a new patch of basil along the walkway. The scent rose into the late afternoon light, clean, sharp, and rooted. Inside the house, she placed new cushions on the window seat, steamed the curtains, and opened every window to let in fresh air. For the first time in years, the place felt lived in by someone fully present, not monitored, not managed, lived in. By 4 o'clock, she had set the dining table with her best china. Each plate rested on a linen napkin, folded precisely, wine glasses polished to catch the light. The roast chicken was in the oven, a lemon tart chilled in the fridge. The house smelled of rosemary, citrus, and something else. Something like warmth returned. At 5:30, the doorbell rang. Helen came first, with a homemade bean salad. Then Louise, carrying her bridge set and a bottle of dry Riesling. Even Carolyn, who rarely left her house after sunset, arrived wearing a cardigan Margaret hadn't seen since 1998, and a grin that stretched ear to ear. "Welcome home," Helen said, pulling Margaret into a gentle hug. "We've missed you." "I've been here the whole time," Margaret replied. "I just wasn't quite myself." The women settled into the dining room, laughter curling into the corners of the house like incense. They passed plates, refilled wine, and raised their glasses after Margaret offered a toast. "To capacity and clarity," she said, "and to women who do not disappear, no matter how quietly they are pushed." They drank, and they stayed, long past sunset, talking about sons who forget, daughters who rewrite history, doctors who dismiss, and the quiet power of the word no. When the last guest left, Margaret stood on the porch with the night wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl. The stars blinked above the freshly weeded garden. The porch light cast a warm circle around the entryway, its glow catching on the brass handle she now gripped with a quiet kind of triumph. She turned to go back inside when a voice floated across the fence. "Hey there, Margaret," said the neighbor, a man in his 40s walking his dog. "House looks beautiful. Fresh paint? I see you've been busy." "I have," she replied, nodding with a smile. He hesitated, then added casually, "Forgive me if I'm out of line, but didn't your daughter live here?" Margaret didn't flinch. She looked him in the eye and answered softly, but without apology. "Not anymore." She stepped back into the house, locked the door behind her with a new, solid click, and picked up the envelope waiting on the hall table. Inside was an invitation, heavy cardstock, gold lettering. You are cordially invited to deliver the closing remarks at the Savannah Legal Summit. Below it, in bold, keynote speaker, Margaret E. Sinclair. They doubted my mind. I redrew the map. Margaret sat in her sunroom, surrounded by light and silence, with a microphone clipped gently to her sweater and a glass of iced mint tea beside her laptop. The windows were cracked just enough to let in the smell of fresh-cut grass, and the faint sounds of birdsong accompanied her intro like a quiet ensemble. She tapped the keyboard, watched the red recording light blink on, and spoke with the same deliberate steadiness that had carried her through the courtroom. "Welcome to Still of Sound Mind," she began. "This is a podcast for every woman over 60 who's ever been told she's confused, overreacting, or just plain tired. My name is Margaret Sinclair, and today we're going to talk about what happens when the people you raised try to rewrite the paperwork before your story is finished." She paused, not for dramatic effect, but to let the truth breathe. "I am not a lawyer," she continued, "but I worked beside them for 40 years. I've read every clause, filed every affidavit, and made coffee for every partner who forgot who really ran the office. I buried my husband, buried my patient, and nearly buried my own power, but I got it back, and I want to help you do the same." She reached over, scrolled through the show notes on her screen, and began the first segment titled, "Red Flags, Blue Ink, How They Start Taking Without Asking." It wasn't a performance, it was a reckoning. The first episode went live quietly on a Tuesday morning. She didn't promote it much, just an email to a few friends, a mention at her bridge group, and a flyer thumbtacked at the library near the large print books. But by Friday, she'd received over 200 downloads and an invitation from a local radio station asking if she'd do a guest segment. By the end of the second week, her inbox was filled with messages from women across Georgia and then beyond, each one telling their version of what Margaret had lived through. "My nephew convinced me to sign something I didn't read. My sister told the family I wasn't well. I've never missed a mortgage payment in my life. They said I was better off not knowing how the accounts were managed." Margaret responded to every email personally. She didn't use auto-replies or form letters. She wrote back in her own voice, measured, calm, and always ending with a line she'd repeated so often it had become her signature. "We're not invisible, we're not unstable, and we're not done." By the end of the month, she'd been approached by a small but reputable publisher in Atlanta. The editor, a woman named Denise Langley, had listened to every episode. "Your voice is measured," Denise said over their first phone call. "It's sharp but not bitter, honest but not theatrical. You're saying the thing most women your age have never been allowed to say out loud. They tried to erase me, and I wouldn't let them. That's a book." Margaret didn't reply right away. She was staring out the window at her blooming tulips, the ones she'd replanted with her bare hands just days after the ruling. She thought about how deep roots held even through the coldest winters. "I'll need to write it on my terms," she said finally. "Of course. I want to include the names of the laws that helped me, not just the names of the people who didn't." Denise smiled through the phone. "That's exactly why we want you." The contract arrived a week later. Margaret read every line, circled 3 clauses in red, and mailed back the revised version with her own pen. She titled the book Still of Sound Mind, a companion to the podcast, a declaration in itself. Not memoir, not guidebook. Something in between. A map of survival inked by a woman who refused to be written out. On a warm Friday afternoon, she returned to the bank that had once called to confirm her mental incapacity. She didn't go to make a scene. She went to close an old account, one she no longer needed. The same manager from before greeted her nervously. Margaret smiled politely, handed over her ID, and waited. As the paperwork was signed and stamped, she leaned forward slightly and said in her calmest voice, "She told the bank I was losing it. I told them I'd take my house." She took the receipt, folded it once, and stood. "And my dignity, to go."